Well, class, this is your professor, Dr. Lee, and we're going into week 12, continuing to week 13 with what's called the Middle East conflict. This could be a little bit confusing, so let me first of all give you a little bit of a sort of case history of how this developed. I was at the University of Wales. I was doing a master's degree in religion, politics and international relations. This was looking at the way that religion, international relations and politics work together and sometimes against each other, but each one sort of impacts the other discipline. So politics is highly influenced by religion, religion by politics, and also international relations. It was in March of 2003 that something very pivotal happened. I was at that time studying terrorism and war, just war theory, Clausewitz and war, and on March the 19th I was studying religion and war at the university as a full-time student. And now I don't know if any of you recall what happened on March the 19th, 2003. I certainly can remember very well because I wrote my master's dissertation on that date, which was the declaration for the motives for the Iraq War 2003, the Declaration of Motives for the Iraq War 2003. What an incredible, fortuitous opportunity to be studying religion and war when the Gulf War was declared on March the 19th, 2003. And it was in this dissertation and this study which I did that I not only covered the Iraq War, but I also included a wider perspective of the Middle East conflict. And the university liked this and suggested that for doctoral work I should develop this area. And in consultation with my professor, we decided to narrow this down to the work of John Nelson Darby. I first of all learnt that one studies Darby at one's peril. He's extreme, very, very convoluted, very, very difficult to understand, very difficult to read, and I embarked upon what was about 8 years of research and study for my 2 doctoral degrees. So the first doctoral degree was in John Nelson Darby. There's the book that I published, and the second one was also in John Nelson Darby, and that was the second one. That was my PhD, and the first one I did for my PhD. Now, I need to give a little bit of very, very convoluted history of what was happening prior to Darby. And he was about the 1800s, about 1880. But let me go before Darby and tell you what exactly was happening, particularly in England, with the restoration of the Jewish nation, because a lot of people think that the restoration of the Jewish nation is a new concept, something that is fairly modern, and really it goes back to certainly about 1653, because a very fortuitous, pivotal event happened on that date. Now, some of our scholars, some of our divines were looking at biblical prophecy. And the first prophecy that was of immediate interest was the book of Daniel chapter 2. And when you look at Daniel chapter 2, you read about a vision by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was the one who took the southern kingdom captive in 722 for the first one. 586 BCE, he took the southern kingdom captive, and he was the king, the Babylonian king, and he had a dream. And he had this dream, he called the wise men together, and he said, okay, I want you to not only tell me the interpretation of the dream, but I actually want you to tell me what the dream was in the first place. And of course the wise men, the Chaldeans, etc., the astronomers and those that interpreted prophecy and dreams said, well, you've got to tell us the dream first and then we can tell you the answer. Well, the king was pretty wise. He said, I'm sorry, but if I tell you what the dream is, you will have the answer anyway. So if you're that wise, you will know both the dream and the interpretation. Well, the wise men, astrologers, were about to go off to had their heads chopped off, I guess, or they were about to be imprisoned, certainly to lose their lives, when they suddenly remembered that in this captivity of 586 BCE, that they'd taken this person called Daniel. And so they said, oh, well, we have a Jewish person, an Israelite by the name of Daniel, perhaps he can help out and say what the dream was and also the interpretation. And indeed, Daniel interpreted the king Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And the interpretation, you can read this in the book of Daniel chapter 2, was what was called the four kingdoms. And he said that basically the first kingdom was that of the Babylonians, of which Nebuchadnezzar was king. That would be the first kingdom. But after that would arise another kingdom, and that would be the Medo-Persian kingdom, followed by the Greek and the Roman Empire. So this was the interpretation of the dream. And fast forward to England, when scholars were looking at this dream, and they thought that they could work out prophetical history, prophetical interpretation of not just this particular prophecy, but if this one worked, and it appeared that to the divines it did work, then what about the other prophecies in the Bible, in Daniel and Revelation? And so what about Daniel chapter 9, 25 to 27, I believe it is, 9, 25, 27, when we talk about the 70 weeks. That became a very pivotal prophecy that was used by many, many people, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church, William Miller. There was also another one in the book of Revelation that talks about the 1,260 days, or the 42 months. And that was also an important prophecy. Now, if we take this prophecy, and let me see if I can find that in the Bible, because I can't remember all these prophecies, but in the Revelation 11, chapter 11, verse 2, it talks about the 42 months. And it also talks about, that's chapter 2, chapter 11, verse 2, and verse 3, it talks about the 1,260 days. And if you work out what 42 months is, you will also be able to work out that 42 months does equal 1,260 days. Now, what happened with this is very, very simple, or very complicated, depending which way you want to take it. But the view was, Daniel chapter 2, the four kingdoms worked, and the scholars in England, particularly in England, thought that if the if the first prophecy, Daniel chapter Two, if that worked, and Rome was the final kingdom, if we could, for example, take the date for the fall of Rome, Edward Gibbon, did Rome fall or did it not fall? That's a good question. But if we could take the date and add the 1,260 days to that, we would find out the end of the world. Now, before you think that these were harebrained, Bible-thumping fanatics, many of them were scholars, profound scholars. So, if we take, for example, Joseph Mead, and he would be 1586 to, 1638, he was a professor at Cambridge. Or how about we take William Prynne? That's a strange name, Prynne, William Prynne, 1600 to 1669. Well, he graduated from Oxford, studied law. He was a biblical scholar. Another person, rather strange name, Sir Peter Pett. Peter's always a good name. Sir Peter Pett, what a wonderful name. 1630 to 1699, studied at Cambridge. Thomas Good, 1609 to 1678, was a professor at Oxford. Now, all of these, and a lot more, were looking at prophetical interpretation and trying to come up with the end of the world and when Jesus would return. Now, so let's take a simple case, and there's nothing simple about this, but let's take a simple case. The sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 of the Common Era. If we take 410, add 1260 of the book of Revelation, which I quoted, you come up with 1670. So the thought was that Christ would come back in 1670. Now, these dates were so wild. When was the fall of Rome? Would this work? Do we add any other prophetical interpretation? But certainly the 1600s were sort of very pivotal. And the result of this is something that you can check up in the history books. You may be able to go online and be able to check it up. But something amazing happened in England. It's never happened in America, but it's happened in England. And that was on the April the 20th of 1653. We had the Cromwellian Protectorate. It was Charles the King. He was assassinated about 1649. But we had the parliamentary system under William Cromwell. And on April the 20th, 1653, Cromwell goes into Parliament and does a straight coup d'etat. He dissolves Parliament by using the army by force of arms. We've never had anything like this before. We haven't had it in America. We have had it in England, the one coup d'etat, Oliver Cromwell, April the 20th, 1653. It's in history. And he establishes, on July the 4th, 1653, he establishes what's called the Fifth Monarchist Government. Back to Daniel chapter 2. The four kingdoms, the four monarchies, and the fifth monarchy he believed would be the reign of King Jesus, or the return of King Jesus, and factored into this was the restoration of the Jewish nation. That was a key factor into the dates, into the interpretation. In fact, it was even it was resolved as part of the platform for the Fifth Monarchist government to dissolve Chancery, our law courts, and establish the Sanhedrin of 70, the restoration of the Jewish nation. This has been going on for many, many years. So this is a sort of potted history of what was happening in England with William Cromwell, 1653, and how it tied into biblical interpretation. And what is absolutely fascinating, if you study the Leviathan of Thomas Hobbes and you study John Locke, please bear in mind something that's not in the textbook. You will have to research this, but look at where John Locke was in 1652. Because John Locke went to Oxford in 1652, and in his second year at Oxford, 1653, April the 20th, a coup d'etat. Tyranny in the government. So if you're worried about or interested about Locke and his argument against Hobbes and the Leviathan, his question was, if we have tyranny in the government, how do we remove it? Very, very important discussion today, and you know the reason for that. But that was, John Locke was in his second year at Oxford University when Cromwell effected a straight coup d'etat and evicted Parliament by the force of arms by using the army. What on earth were they talking about at Oxford University in Locke's second year? What would happen in Columbia College if this happened? Wouldn't we be discussing it? Well, maybe not now because of the virus that's closed Columbia down. And of course now I've got the time to actually do the first video for you on the Middle East conflict. So that's a little sort of potted history of the background to the study that I was doing. And then I studied John Nelson Darby, and I was looking at his interpretation, his prophetical interpretation, and as I said, wrote 2 doctoral dissertations on this, and about 8 years of study. So when you look and you read about Darby, I'm the person who studied Darby really in depth. Why is this important? Darby has very, very convoluted ideas, extremely convoluted, very difficult to read. And he is important because his thoughts, his ideas, his religious interpretation, his prophetical interpretation became the background, the backbone of American evangelicalism. And if you take, for example, the King James Version of the Bible, then Cyrus Scofield, his disciple, put annotated notes to the King James Bible and produced the Scofield Bible. And that influenced Americans in a profound way. If we take, for example, the seminary, the Dallas Theological Seminary, that came out from John Nelson Darby. So in studying Darby, I was able to understand the idea of how American Protestant evangelicalism functioned. And not only functioned, but its relationship with the nation of Israel. Because very, very simply, and let's start with a definition. Let's make it very concise and so we understand what we're talking about. We have Zionism. There are 2 forms of Zionism. The first one comes out from Theodor Herzl, and let me just define it very simple. Zionism is the national aspiration of Israel to return and remain in the Holy Land. Purely Jewish. Purely Jewish. Zionism. When we have Christian Zionism, that is the evangelical Protestant church supporting the nation of Israel for Christian, Protestant, prophetical interpretation. Simply put, according to the evangelical church in America, you cannot have the end of the world, the return of Jesus and the rapture. By the way, I debunked the rapture in 2010. It was published by Oxford University Press. That was part of my history and the research. But you cannot have the end of the world, the return of King Jesus, the rapture, the millennium. You cannot have that without factoring in the Jews in the Holy Land, the building of the third temple, that's all part and parcel. So when we look at international relations, we have to bear in mind that evangelicalism factors in the nation of Israel. You cannot have the end of the world without Israel. But let's come back to Zionism, and it started with this book here, a book called Judenstaat, or The Jewish State, Theodor Herzl, and that was written of 1895. And let me just read a little bit from here, because this is the start of Zionism, and it's here, The Jewish State, Theodor Herzl, and this was written in 1895. And if I can come up to the date here, yes, that faith was tested in January of 1895 when Herzl reported on an especially nasty scene in Paris. So we're basically in 1895. Now, this was produced by Herzl. He was in Vienna. And in the same year, 1895, a Protestant, well, Church of England, I believe he was, minister by the name of Heckler, William Heckler, saw this book and immediately went to Herzl and declared that Herzl was the end time prophet that the Christian church was basically looking for. And what happened with this was absolutely remarkable, because we got 1895. It's a very rare book produced of 500 copies of this book. These are the facsimile letters of many of the main people at that time, including Kaiser Wilhelm II, and I will share some of this possibly on the website. But here, for example, is a facsimile copy. You can just see here, if I come up here, this is a letter written by Kaiser Wilhelm II of the original letter. But I want to refer back to an earlier letter to the Grand Duke of Baden. And this was written also in 1895, and it's to His Royal Highness the Grand Duke of Baden. Basically, he says, "My God, I've just got a copy of Theodor Herzl's Judenstaat, the Jewish State, and he foretells that he is basically the end-time prophet," and he goes into prophetical interpretation. And it almost comes to a Bible study. I'll see if I can include this actually in the course of week 12. 500 copies. My copy is copy 409, an extremely rare book, and these are copies of the original letters extant at that time. So what we need to do now is that Heckler meets Herzl and declares basically what he believes Herzl to be, what the Jewish nation is going to be, and here is the diaries of Theodor Herzl. So let me pull out the diary here and refer to the author of the Jewish State, this one here, and see what he says about William Heckler. This is dated March the 10th, 1895. The Reverend William H. Heckler, chaplain to the British Embassy in Vienna, called on me. A likeable, sensitive man with a long grey beard of a prophet, he waxed enthusiastic over my solution. He, too, regards my movement as a prophetic crisis, one he foretold 2 years ago, for he has calculated in accordance with the prophecy dating from Omar's reign, 637 to 638, that after 42 prophetical months, we come back to the 42 months, 1,260 days in the book of Revelation, chapter 11, that after 42 months, that is 1,260 years, Palestine will be restored to the Jews. This would make it 1897 to 1898. When he had read my book, The Jewish State, he immediately hurried to Ambassador Monson and told him the foreordained movement is here. Heckler declares my movement to be a biblical one, even though I proceed rationally in all points. He wants to place my tract in the hands of some German princes, and indeed he does go to the Kaiser Wilhelm II. He used to be a tutor in the household of the Grand Duke of Baden. He knows the German Kaiser and thinks he can give me an audience. Here is a Christian ordained minister factoring in the Jewish state into what we call Christian end-time events, eschatology, the end-time events. And this, simply put, means that the evangelical church in America looks to the Jewish nation as de facto. You need the Jews in the Holy Land, 1947-48. You need the Jews to be maintained in the Holy Land, and that is de facto for the return of King Jesus. And this is what is Christian Zionism. It's the evangelical church factoring the Jewish nation into Christian end time events. Christian Zionism. This is Zionism. This is William Heckler. This is the natural aspiration of the Jewish nation to occupy the Holy Land in perpetuity, if you like. I'm very fortunate in a sense because apart from having you as students, I can't be anti-Semitic. And that's very difficult for me. My father was a German Jew. Of course, you understand that in Judaism you have to be, your mother has to be Jewish to be, descendants to be Jewish. It comes from it's matriarchal, not patriarchal. But my father was Jewish, so it'd be very, very difficult for me to be anti-Semitic. Also, most of my family, or part of my family, went to Auschwitz, and we died in. They died in Auschwitz. My uncles, Kurt and Heinz, were young people, and they ended in in Auschwitz. So it's a subject that's very of interest to me. I'm also very much interested in the evangelical church. In the next part of the video, I'll look a little bit more about this, because if we take the concept of religion, politics and international relations and how these are sort of interwoven and how that they influence each other, then just think about the evangelical position of factoring in the Jewish nation into Christian end-time events. And how does that play out? How does evangelical Christianity get represented at government level? How does it influence the government? How does the government influences the church? There are so many aspects to this, but we'll cover this a bit later. One thing I want to just emphasize on, the two things: Zionism is coming up from Theodor Herzl to Judenstaat, the Jewish state. That is the natural aspiration of the Jews to return, 1947-48, and remain in the Holy Land. Christian Zionism is something that comes out from the evangelical Protestant church that sees the nation of Israel as de facto, as important. You cannot have the return of King Jesus, you cannot have the rapture, you can have the millennium without factoring in the Jewish nation. And so when you read books like The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, or the Left Behind series, books, videos, etc., this is all reinforcing the notion of Christian Zionism. It's a very convoluted, and I would say very dangerous, heresy in the evangelical church. But that's to be covered in a little bit later. I'm going to take a break now, and we'll cover this a little bit in greater detail shortly. Welcome back. We've covered quite a bit of territory previously, and it may be very, very confusing about the various people involved, the prophetical interpretations, etc. But just to recap, let me have my hot chocolate first. Does wonders, hot chocolate does. Essentially, we have two main groups, two main camps. We have Zionism, stemming out of Herzl, 1895, the Jewish state. That is Zionism, the national or the natural aspiration for the Jewish nation to return to the Holy Land, 47, 48, and to remain in the Holy Land. That is Zionism. Then we have Christian Zionism. And Christian Zionism, essentially in a nutshell, says you cannot have the end of the world, the return of Jesus, the rapture, the millennium, without factoring in the Jewish nation. The two go together. It treats the Word of God, the Bible, as a code book of prophetical interpretation. Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel 9, 25 to 27, the 70-week prophecy. Revelation chapter 11, the 1,260 days, the 42-month prophecy. And so it treats this Bible as a code book to foretell the end of the world and the return of Jesus. So let's go back to something that is very pivotal in Genesis chapter 12, which we call the Abrahamic covenant. And in Genesis chapter 12, and this is where it starts, and it reads as follows. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, Now the Lord said to Abraham, Go forth from your country, from your relatives, and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and make your name great, and to you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So essentially, it's saying that God, in his wisdom, bequeathed the land, the Holy Land of to the Jewish people. And that is in perpetuity. And it's unconditional. There are no strings attached. If, for example, I would say to you, if you do the course in Human 4, you will get an A, there's a condition attached. You have to do the work, you have to do the final exam, and if you don't do that, then you won't get an A. You may get a B, may get an F. But what the Protestant Church says is that this covenant, though it is given before the age of writing, though it was given to Abraham, though it goes through completely different calendars, time, culture, everything else, it is an unconditional covenant. It pertains to Abraham and to his descendants in perpetuity. It completely disregards, for example, other chapters, like, for example, Exodus 19:5, just before the Decalogue. Exodus 19:5. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, if, it's conditional, then you shall be my possession, my own possession amongst all the people, and all the earth is mine. If you keep the covenant, then you'll be my people. No. As in Singapore, Bob Jones Jr. once said a wonderful statement. I've never forgotten this. I don't agree much with Bob Jones University, for that matter of fact, but he said that a text out of context is a pretext. A text out of context is a pretext. And if you want to take that Abrahamic covenant out of context, then, I'm sorry, it's a pretext. So let's, for example, assume with evangelical Christianity and with Christian Zionism that this text is unconditional. I wouldn't agree with it. I would say it's conditional. But let's say for a moment it's unconditional. Then you have what has happened with Protestant Christianity. You come to circa 32 to 31 of the Common Era, the time of Jesus. The Jews rejected the Messiah, rejected Christ. But according to this thesis of being unconditional, the Abrahamic covenant, the Jews cannot lose God's salvation, God's blessing. So what actually happens is, at the time of Christ, the Jews reject Christ, but Christ cannot reject the Jews. You get the point? Because the Abrahamic covenant is treated as unconditional, therefore whatever they do, they can't lose the condition. They are God's chosen people. They can reject Christ, they can reject the Messiah, they can reject God, but God cannot reject the Jews. Simple. So what you have is, and we take, let's say, 32 of the Common Era, the time of Christ, his ministry, the Jews reject Christ. What happens is that we have the formation of the New Testament church here on the top level, and that is what we call the earthly kingdom. Below we have the Jewish nation. Let me go back. The Jewish record is blinking at me. Let me just check my record. Right, I just had a blinking light, and when you're videoing yourself, anything can happen, so it appears to be recording okay, that's fine. So we're coming back to the time of Christ, say 32 of the Common Era. The Jews reject Christ. Christ cannot reject the Jews because Christ is God. God has given unconditional covenant, and the Jews are God's chosen people. So we have a truncated system. We have the birth of the Christian church occupying what we would call the top level. These are God's heavenly people, right? They're the Christian church, God's heavenly people, the top level. Underneath that is you've got God's earthly people, the Jews. So you've got God's heavenly people, God's earthly people. For the time being, God's earthly people, the Jews, are on the back burner. And they will remain on the back burner until the second coming of Christ. Right? Heavenly people, the Christian church. Earthly people, the Jews. In his infinite wisdom, at some time in the future, we don't know when, God will want to continue his redemptive work with the Jewish nation. But there's a problem. We have the layer at the top, the heavenly people, and the Jews are on the back burner, God's earthly people. And that is where John Nelson Darby came up with his adaptive theology and created the rapture. Now, I know a lot of people will go to 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and try to establish that the rapture comes from book of Thessalonians, but I'm sorry, it came from John Nelson Darby. And I can substantiate that very easily, and there's reasons why it came from Darby, but this is Darbyite eschatology, end of the world events, etc. Let me get my hot chocolate, etc. Because when you discuss Darby, you need hot chocolate or coffee. That's good. So, Darby effectively put together a way of getting the Christian church out of the way so God could break through to his earthly people, the Jews, and carry on his redemptive work. That is where the rapture comes from. The Christian church is taken away for 7 years in the eternal bleachers in the sky, comes down, and it's at that junction, or at that juncture, when you have the rapture, that you have the restoration of the Jewish nation. Right? The church is gone, exposing the earthly kingdom here, and now that earthly kingdom, God can break through and now carry on his redemptive work with his chosen people, the Jewish nation. Now we have a problem. The restoration of the Jewish nation, well, what is the Jewish nation? Remember, there was at one time the 12 tribes of Israel. After Solomon, you have his son, can't think of his name now, but he was a tyrant. And because of his rule, the nations, the 12 tribes, split. 10 tribes to the north, 2 tribes to the south. The southern kingdom was Judah and Benjamin, and they were 2 tribes. Capital was Jerusalem. The 10 tribes went north. The capital was Samaria. So you got 10 tribes in the north, 2 in the south. South, Judah and Benjamin. The north goes into captivity at 722, and there's no return. The southern kingdom goes into captivity, as we mentioned before, at 586 BCE, goes to Babylon. That's where we have Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and we have the interpretation by our good friend Daniel. So, are we talking about the restoration of the 12 tribes of Israel? Because 10 are the lost tribes, the 10 lost tribes, we don't know what happened to them. Or are we talking about the restoration of Judah and Benjamin, the 2 tribes? It's so sort of hypothetical. And it's based upon the Abrahamic covenant being an unconditional covenant. And once you make that statement, then you open up Pandora's box, the proverbial can of worms, because I don't know how you can make it an unconditional covenant. It's almost nonsensical. I might as well say you can study human 4 unconditionally. You're going to get an A grade. I'm sorry. This is a thing called standards. This is things called conditionality. So, we have a few things happening here. We have Zionism, the aspiration of the Jewish nation, coming up from Herzl, Judenstaat, the Jewish nation, Jewish state, 1895, and we have Christian Zionism based upon the Abrahamic covenant being unconditional. And then we go through to, gosh, what would it be, 1917, the Balfour Declaration. I've got that one somewhere here. Let me see where the Balfour Declaration is. It's got to be here somewhere. Here's the Jewish lobby. That's a good one to read. I'm looking for the Balfour Declaration. It was here earlier. Yeah, so it is, the Balfour Declaration. This is of 1917. Let me read this to you because this also comes up in the discussion and is also very important. Because what is happening at this time is the demise of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks are just about finished by this time, and the whole area occupied by the Ottoman Turks is up for grabs. Who's going to get it? Well, I'm British. The British should have it. Well, the French thought they should have it as well. The Vatican thought they should have it. Lots of people wanted the area that was occupied by the Ottoman Turks. So 1917 was a sort of very pivotal year. And the Rothschilds were petitioned to approach the Lloyd George government, and Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration. Just see what it says here. That, dear Lord Rothschild, and this is December, I think it's the 2nd of 1917. Did I say 1919? 1917, there we are. Yes, 1917. I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, that's the Lloyd George government, yes, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government wish with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this subject or object. In using it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish companies, in other words, the Palestinians, etc., etc. Basically, here was the Lloyd George government, Balfour, saying, here is a land without people for a people without land, and bequeathed essentially the land to the Jewish state. But of course, you've seen Lawrence of Arabia. I guess you've seen that wonderful film, Lawrence of Arabia, read about Lawrence of Arabia, good old British Lawrence. Well, he was sent to the Sharif of Mecca, and his mandate was that to do a deal with the Sharif of Mecca, that the Arabs would take care of the land of Palestine, and we would recompense them, being British. We would give them a little bit of land, let them do the dirty work, and then we'll compensate them with a little plot of land, etc. And so we have 1917, we have not only the Balfour Declaration, but we have Lawrence of Arabia going to the Sharif of Mecca. But there's also, we also have Sykes going to Picot of France and doing a deal with France. I mean, 1970 was a wonderful vintage. So we had the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1917, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and we also had a wonderful, another episode of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russians with the Bolshevik Revolution. Of course, we have now the exposing of the Sykes-Picot, and the sort of the lid was taken off the box, and they realised what the British were trying to do. So the Balfour Declaration 1917 was extremely interesting. Now, we come back to this concept of religion, politics and international relations. I'd like to, without being politically motivated one way or another, suggest that currently a large support of evangelicalism is going one way because certain things are happening, and you can look at this in the news that, how can we say, I'm trying to be politically correct, but it goes back to the old ideas of the mafia, the triads, etc. They will do protection of one kind. They will protect a person, but then there's a time when they're basically calling in the favours. I would like to suggest that there was a large, and that we know there was a large evangelical support for the current president. And the big question that a lot of people ask is that how can evangelical Christianity support the president? Let me sharp angle this, because I'm opposed to Jerry Falwell. I always have been, and therefore I did apply many, many years ago to be a professor at Liberty University, and for 7 years I've been teaching at Liberty University online. I resigned actually 2 weeks ago over the policies that they're adopting. I don't agree with it. But a number of years ago, the students put together a petition. I think it's available on the internet. You can maybe Google this, but they put together a petition, and the petition said that we do not believe the Donald Trump, he was not president at that time, so it was several years ago, had any sort of Christian ethics at all, and yet this is a Christian university. And the result was that the Chancellor, Jerry Falwell, vetoed the petition and squashed it, and at least I got a gag letter saying that we will not discuss this to the media, etc. And now I'm not a faculty member, I can discuss this. But the point was, I did get a gag letter telling me I cannot discuss this. The key here is, I don't want to be politically incorrect or correct, etc., but I want you to think about some of the things that have happened in the last few years. The annexing of the Golan Heights, Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the US Embassy in Jerusalem, Judaism being more than a state religion. I don't know if you get my drift here, but there's a lot of support for the nation of Israel. Is it healthy or not? Up to you. You know, this is something I want you to look at. In this course, over the next 2 weeks, we'll be discussing Zionism and Christian Zionism. It's convoluted, but it's very, very important. You're students. My job is to give you the information, allow you to do the research, and for you to come up with your own decision and make up your own minds about religion and politics, international relations. But I do want you to be educated. I do want you to be aware of factual information. There's enough information out there, particularly with the virus, which is why I'm home drinking hot chocolate today. There's enough misinformation out there. We want to be factual, honest, and true. So as we embrace Christian Zionism, many of you will be attached to a Christian church, and this may be something that is new to you, and you may think it's something you find you do not agree with. But let's put aside our feelings, our emotions, our subjectivity, and let's be objective. Let's look at the evidence, let's look at what's out there. Because we've seen time and time again that when people take the Bible and use it as a code book, I mean, who was the last person? Family Radio and Howard, gosh, what was his name? Can't think of his name now. But Family Radio foretold the end of the world, the return of King Jesus in so many different years. I've lost count, but he died recently, trying to project the end of the world, trying to project the return of Christ. And then we take 1843. Oh gosh, what's his name? Howard. I don't produce notes for this. I just speak from my heart. But 1843 was a pivotal year because when a potato farmer, William Miller, predicted that the end of the world and Christ would return in 1843, so many people, and if you read the newspaper stories of that time, people sold their farms, their homes, their businesses, based upon the prophetical interpretation of William Miller. And they went out on the hill waiting for the end of the world to come. Of course, it didn't happen. And well, we had a problem with the crossover between BCE and CE. Therefore, was a year's difference, so it's going to happen in 1844. Same thing happened, that people sold their farms, sold their homes, and went out there waiting for the end of the world. It never happened. Perhaps one good thing that did come out of that and was the fact that we have breakfast cereal. That's William Harvey Kellogg at Battle Creek Sanitarium, and of course he was pioneering health foods, and the whole breakfast cereal came out from that person, the doctor William Harvey Kellogg, and Post was working for Kellogg, so we have Post cereal as well. So there are a few good things coming out from the from prophetical interpretation and biblical prophecy, etc. Howard something. Howard. Can't think of his name. You'll know who it is. Family Radio. Check it out. So, the first discussion board should, for example, the land be given up, etc., or what would happen because it's promised to the Jews by God. Think about some of the points that I've raised. And Harold Camping, that was it. Harold Camping. Finally I found out who it was, Harold Camping. Look up Harold Camping. Harold Camping, Camping. That is a fruitcake. He was an engineer. And he decided to go into biblical prophecy, foretell the end of the world, and absolutely disastrous. It was terrible. And we have so much about this. I don't believe for a minute that the Bible was supposed to be some sort of magical code book for the end of the world. I do hope that these 2 weeks will be challenging to you, because what I'm trying to do is go back to the studies that I had at the University of Wales, where we had an interdisciplinary master's degree, religion, politics and international relations, and these three coalesce, these three impact each other. And if you're looking at the political scene, you will see religious overtones driving it. Now bear in mind that when we talk about Christian Zionism, we're not talking about something that's very small. I think at the last count, it was over 30 million Americans were Christian Zionists. That's about 17.5% of the US voting population. So it's a large chance that can affect politics in one way or another. So I want you to think about this subject of Christian Zionism, the Middle East conflict, in this terms, that we've studied various religions and we look at the religion as individual religions without seeing how that one religion can impact another religion. But if we look at the Middle East conflict, just the thought of building a third temple on the Dome of the Rock impacts Islam. It impacts the Jewish nation, it impacts Christianity. These three are impacted just with the idea of building the third temple. Where it comes from, God only knows. But think also that the fact that they've created the artifacts for the parts of the temple, fabricated that, they've got the heifer, etc. These things, I believe, have been put together for the third temple. But what was a temple in the first place? The Temple of Solomon. It was a sacrificial system. The sacrificial system ended 70 of the Common Era with the destruction of the Second Temple, and it went over to, you studied Judaism, it went over to prayer, the synagogue. There is no more temple worship. But if you have a third temple, you're going back from the synagogue to the third temple, you're going back to animal sacrifice. Well, I'm sorry, but what is the plenary work of Christ at the cross was no more animal sacrifice. Therefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, death by sin, so death spread to all men, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. But Christ becomes the Saviour. And so if you have the Saviour and no more animal sacrifice, then what do you do with the third temple when you go back from Christianity back to animal sacrifice? I don't know. It doesn't make sense. It means that Christianity, in promulgating a third temple, is undermining and destroying the very essence of what they're about, which is Christianity and not a temple worship. I'm as confused as anyone else on this. And if you are confused, if you don't understand about all the terms I've used, the various prophecies, it's extremely, extremely confusing. Very, very few people really understand what is actually happening and the underpinnings of Christian Zionism. Hopefully, get my hot chocolate, finish that off. Hopefully, and you're a great class. Do you know this is the first video I've done for Human 4 on Christian Zionism? But I think you're special, and I think you want to have more information to work on, particularly for the discussion boards. If you want to use this talk, this lecture, in your discussion board, just put down the video, and you can put down March 2020, Dr. Peter Lee. That will be fine. That will count as your citation. Do have a citation. And Dr. Stephen Sizer is also a very good source to look at. And we are discussing subjects that are very, very dangerous, extremely dangerous. Stephen is a good friend of mine, and he's been attacked intellectually, and that was distressing. And I too have been attacked as well intellectually. So these are very controversial areas. We speak with we speak because we want you to be informed. We want, at least I want you to be informed. I want you to be making rational, not subjective opinions. I want you to back up what you say with facts. That's important. So I just appreciate you having you as students, And if you've got questions, just send me an email. If you're confused, join the rest of us, because it is a very confusing subject. But hopefully you'll enjoy this one of Christian Zionism. So, thank you.